So seriously, can we get on with the tips and tricks? Yes, we can. I think I've covered all of the pre-stuff, so let's move on and talk about some of the big three, what I like to call them, the big three things that you can do to help make your presentations better. The first of which is formatting properly for the screen. And when we do that, we're talking about aspect ratios. How many people in the room know what an aspect ratio is? You're pretty good, pretty good. All right, about 80%. That's not bad. That's actually really good. Aspect ratio is the shape of the screen. We've all seen this. In fact, we're seeing it now. This is the standard presentation screen that has gotten us through the last 20 years in the meeting industry. And this shaped screen is known as 4:3. That is to say that the ratio of the width to the height is 4:3. 4 wide by 3 high. If you divide the width by the height, you're going to wind up with a number that is 1.33 repeating, 1.34. So whatever your screen dimensions actually are, whether it's 8:6 or something like that, if you divide the width by the height and it comes out to being 1.3, that's going to be this size, this shaped screen. Now, with the widespread acceptance and the popularity of widescreen HD televisions coming along, we're starting to see more and more screens that are actually formatted 16:9. And again, not dealing with the actual dimensions of the screen, but the ratio of the width to the height. If you divide the width by the height on a 16:9 screen, you're going to get 1.77 repeating, or 1.78. So when you're looking at your AV bids, it's a good idea to take a look and see what the sizes of the screens are. And then take that width, divide it by the height, and then you'll know what the aspect ratio is. So why are aspect ratios important? Because there's nothing worse than spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on beautiful high-definition video screens, not to mention the lighting and the staging and the table settings, only to have your CEO come down at 5 minutes before the event, hand you a flash drive, load it up, and it looks like this. This is an example of poorly formatted PowerPoint presentation. Not because he's lazy or anything like that, but probably because nobody told him. Because 4:3 is the stock default size for a PowerPoint presentation. When you open up and hit New Document, you get a squarish presentation size, not the rectangular presentation size of 16:9. In this example, you have a 4:3 presentation being displayed on a widescreen, high-definition projection screen. This is known as pillar boxing, indicated by the black bars on the left and right. Now, depending on the level of your equipment, you may be able to replace those black bars with something more colorful, like a blue background or things like that. But at the very least, you're going to have something that needs to take up that space that's not being used by the presentation. It's pillar boxing because it looks like pillars on the left and right. Now, likewise, this presentation here is improperly formatted as well. It is a widescreen formatted presentation being displayed on a 4:3 screen. In this case, what you've got is someone got the incorrect information and was told it was going to be a 16:9 widescreen presentation, came down, showed up on site, loaded up the presentation, and now this is known as letterboxing, in which you've got black bars on the top and bottom of the screen to, again, fill that space to make sure that you can see the entire presentation without stretching it. Here's another example of a presentation that's been poorly formatted. Now, this is another way of dealing with a 4:3 presentation that's being presented on high definition widescreen screens, and that's the stretch. You can actually just pull the presentation. But a lot of times you'll actually notice this on your televisions at home, where you're suddenly watching a movie and you realize that the person's face is just much wider than it should be. This is because the movie was formatted, or the television show was formatted in a 4:3, but they don't want it to look like it, so they've stretched it out to make it fit all the way across your screen. In all of these examples, though, where we have presentations that are not properly formatted, and it's not just presentations either. It could be video, it could be graphics, it could be any number of media elements not properly formatted for the screens that are in your room. In all of these examples, it's immediately obvious to whoever's watching them that something isn't quite right. Something isn't formatted properly. Those black bars scream to me when I'm watching, somebody didn't pay attention to what was on the AV bid, or somebody didn't pay attention to what was in the space when they were on the site visit. So when it comes to meeting and event planners, you're the ones that have to translate that information from your AV provider, whoever that may be, or your venue, if it's a built-in, to your clients, either directly to the speakers involved or to the people who have direct access to the speakers involved. That's your job as a meeting planner, to make sure that that information gets properly conveyed. Now, before I show you how to do that in PowerPoint and Keynote, I want to talk really quickly about more exotic aspect ratios that we're starting to see in the events industry. One of them is called panoramic or blended screens. If you hear this terminology, it's a generic term for things that are even wider than 16 by 9. Here's an example where you've got one where the aspect ratio of this screen is actually 3:1. Now, this screen's physical dimensions, I believe, were 30 feet by 10 feet high. But ignore the physical dimensions. What's the aspect ratio? 3:1. Blended screens or panoramic screens are created by stacking multiple projectors side by side and linking them together with hardware and software that blends the image across all of those projectors. Now, as high-definition TVs have come down in cost and are becoming more available, we're starting to see them placed in unusual places, such as embedded in podiums and things like that. This now, instead of a 16 by 9 aspect ratio, is a 9 by 16 aspect ratio, in that it is 9 wide by 16 high when comparing the width to the height. The other thing that we're starting to see this as is as a dedicated screen for speakers when they're talking. So in addition to having outboard screens that show the presentations, you'll have a dedicated 9 by 16 screen that shows just the speaker. Now, just as Americans might be getting a little heavier here and there, we're still more taller than we are wide. So this type and size of screen actually works very well for being a dedicated speaker screen. So, how do we do it? How do we set the aspect ratio in PowerPoint? That's what I'd like to show you next. So in order to set the aspect ratio in PowerPoint, you go to the Design tab and go to Page Setup, almost as though you were going to print it out in a Word document. Under Page Setup, we now have this nice drop-down box that says 4 by 3 or 16 by 9. So if you know that you're going to be presenting on a 16 by 9 screen, just select that one from the drop-down box. We go back, and bingo, we now have our beautiful widescreen formatted PowerPoint presentation. In previous editions, it was up in the menu, not on the ribbon, also under Page Setup, as though you were going to set it like you were printing out a Word document. But you only had what you have here, which is the width and the height in inches. So it has nothing to do with the actual resolution of projectors or anything like that. For some reason, PowerPoint likes to think in inches. Now, I will say, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to try and do any conversion or anything like that. Think again about the aspect ratio of what it is that you're doing. If you take the 10 inches wide by the 5.63 inches high, that gets you that magic 1.77 number if you divide the width by the height. If you go back to the 4.3, it changes it to the 10 by 7.5 inches. Again, divide 10 by 7.5, you get the 1.33 magic number of a 4 by 3 screen. So when we're dealing with the exotic aspect ratios that I was talking to you about, this is where you can set that in PowerPoint. So in the instance that I showed you before, where we had a 3 by 1 screen, all you would have to do is set this to maybe 9 by 3. And there is our beautiful panoramic-sized PowerPoint presentation, all nice and neatly formatted, with no converting or anything like that to worry about. And then your video crew will be able to size it and scale it appropriately when you play it. Now, as I said, I want to show you how to do some of these things in Keynote as well. If anything, just to show you that it's not some big scary program, and it's actually very intuitive and easy to use. If anything, I think in a lot of times easier to use than PowerPoint. Why? Because it basically asks you this question when you create a new Keynote. You go in and you say, well, I'm going to use this default theme of white on black. And you can see right here, before the point where you say choose, is the slide size. 800 by 600 or 1024 by 768 are both 4 by 3 aspect ratio sizes. 1280 by 720, 1680 by 1050, and 1920 by 1080 are all 16 by 9 aspect ratios. And in fact, 1280 by 720 and 1920 by 1080 are actually the two high-definition television standards. So if you know that your piece is going to be used later in a production piece that maybe be put out on high-definition TV or a Blu-ray or something like that, you definitely want to make sure that you're appropriately sized. Now, when we just choose this, I'm going to zoom out here so you can see, we have our 16 by 9 aspect ratio screen all ready and waiting for us. Now, one of the other things that I like about Keynote is that unlike PowerPoint where you're setting inches and things like that, you can just go in and tell it exactly what you want that screen size to be. Because when you're dealing with some of the more exotic aspect ratios, you'll be able to go to your AV provider and say, tell me exactly what the resolution, how many dots wide by how many dots high, that's what resolution is, what should I format this presentation for? And they may say 1236 by 912 because you're taking into account the projectors, and they have to blend a little bit and things like that. So it could be a very unusual number. But Keynote doesn't care. They'll set it to whatever you want it to be. This can be 1456 wide by 300 high. And there it is, ready to be formatted and played with. And it even does its best to adjust any text or anything like that might already be in there and size it appropriately. So from a technical standpoint, that's another reason why I personally prefer Keynote, is that I can get very specific with exactly what the resolution of my slides is going to be. One of the reasons that I like working in Keynote is because of this ability to actually set the resolution to exactly what your AV provider tells you. So now you've already gone and talked to your AV provider and found out what aspect ratio it needs to be.